After the fall of the Xiongnu Empire in the 1st century, the steppe world of eastern Eurasia descended into chaos. As several Xiongnu successor states were established further south, and the so-called Huna people appeared in the west, the central Mongolian Plains became a battlefield of Turko-Mongol infighting. After nearly 200 years, a new stable state emerged that managed to unite most of the tribes under its banner, the Rouran Khaganat. Its ruling dynasty descended from the Mongolic Donghu tribe, the same one that had been driven out of Mongolia by the Xiongnu. Now, the once defeated made their turn. The Rouran established the first true steppe empire with a sophisticated hierarchy and bureaucracy, and expanded their territory into Manchuria in the east and Kazakhstan in the west. Over time, they aimed control over the Silk Roads and got into conflict with the Wei Empire in China and the Hephthalite Empire in Central Asia. After 200 years of supreme rule, the Rouran were defeated by the ascending Ashina tribe of Bumin and Steppe. But their dynasty did not vanish. Instead, large parts found refuge in China and tried to regain control over the eastern steppes, which resulted in a prolonged war against the Turks. Another part migrated even further away to the west. Suspiciously, just as these Rouran nobles appeared on the vicinity of Eastern Europe, the so-called Avars appear in ancient sources too. For a long time, connections between the Rouran and Avars had been suggested in such sources, but negated in modern academia. Now, new studies confirm that the rulers of the Avars were indeed the Rouran refugees from Asia. Ultimately, they created the Avar Khaganat in Pannonia and waged wars against the Eastern Roman and the Frankish Empire. In this documentary, we are going to explore the earliest history of the Rouran, explain their lifestyle and ideology, and try to understand how Rouran refugees managed to create the mighty Avar Empire in the middle of Europe.
You are watching Khan's Den, your primary source for ancient Turkic history.
The thesis of a kinship between the Rouran and Avars has been negated for several decades. The views that the Avars would have developed completely independent from the Rouran can be easily disproved by several recent studies and archaeological findings. But before we delve into the Rouran-Avar connection, we need to figure out where these people came from in the first place. All roads lead to the Donghu. This was a confederation of several families that developed into a semi-autonomous tribe in Northeast Asia, inhabiting areas in northern Hebei and the western part of Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang, along the Yan Mountains and Greater Khingan Range. Basically, parts of eastern Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, and Manchuria. The Donghu are among the most ancient steppe tribes in recorded history, as their presence can be dated back to the 7th century BC. But these are not the Mongols some might be looking for, because contrary to popular belief, in ancient times Mongolia was not Mongolia. The area of the modern Mongolian Republic was not inhabited by people who spoke a Mongolic language. They would arrive much later, long after the Xiongnu, and slowly take over eastern Mongolia from the Turkic people. And only after Genghis Khan united the tribes to forge the eponymous empire, the rest of Mongolia actually fell to the Mongols. Nonetheless, the Donghu did play a pivotal role in the perpetual conflict between the nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes north and the sedentary states south of the Yellow River. Along the Xiongnu, Jie, Xianbei, Di, and Qiang people, the Donghu were one of 5 designated barbarian people against which the Chinese empires waged war. During the rise of the aforementioned Xiongnu, Modu Chanyu, or Metehan, or Bagatur, drove the Donghu away from the edge of eastern Mongolia. This marked the start of a turbulent period of displacement for the Donghu people. During the period, the main tribe fragmented into several smaller tribes. Among these new groups, the Xianbei stood out as particularly noteworthy. they found themselves in the midst of the chaos that ensued following the fall of the Xiongnu Empire in the 1st century AD. Renowned for their nomadic lifestyle, which was heavily reliant on horse riding and a shared trait with virtually all other steppe peoples of Eurasia, the Xianbei then began to dominate the central Mongolian plains. Their advancement to the west was only stopped, as we have told recently, by a magic snowstorm that was caused by Yueban shamans near Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan in 155 AD. Nonetheless, the Xianbei dominated the areas that were once ruled by the Xiongnu. While considered to be Mongolic, there were most likely Turkic elements, as proposed by Vasily Barthold and Klaus Schonig. It was from these tribes, in any case, that the Rouran emerged and rose to power in the 4th century. Unlike the Xianbei, the Rouran did not establish a tribal confederation, but an actual empire, a monarchy clearly ruled by one ruling dynasty. This was a symbolic comeback after the many centuries of defeat, displacement and chaos caused by the Xiongnu. The Rouran showed resilience and adaptability, and with their state building broke barriers for future steppe rulers. After having succeeded in uniting the majority of the Mongolic and perhaps some Turkic tribes under their banner, the Rouran wielded their collective strength to establish the Khaganat. This newly formed state was the first true steppe empire, characterized by its sophisticated hierarchy and bureaucracy, ruled by the kagan, the supreme ruler of the steppe. The Rouran, unlike the Xianbei, focused on building their state tall. Nonetheless, this empire was a nomadic empire. At this point, it would be wise to clear up certain misconceptions about Eurasian nomadism. Professor Peter B. Golden, who for over 50 years has studied Turkic and Mongolic peoples among others, can give some insight in that regard.
There's this sense that nomadism is somehow a lower standard of living than sedentary. It's not. Nomads had very high standards of living. Indeed, the average nomad lived much better than the average peasant working on a farm. It's a system that requires planning. You can't just say, well, as the Chinese sources said, they wander following the grass and the water. No, if you wander following the grass and the water, you're dead. You have to know where the grass and the water is. And then you have to be able to stake out that area as an area that you control and through which will move your animals. Indeed, we find with most of the great nomadic dynasties that they may have had one capital city, but they usually move between a number of urban areas as they move from pasturage to pasturage.
The economy was not only based on pastoralism, which was typical for nomadic societies, with the many tribes living off of self-sustenance while either paying tribute or going into military service for their overlords, or, as in most cases, both. Perhaps even more important was the control of trade routes along the Silk Roads in Central Asia, as well as the exploitation of agrarian societies to the south, especially those in China. Naturally, this brought them into conflict with several Chinese states. But as the downfall of the Xiongnu proved a few centuries earlier, steppe nomads had to stick together and live in internal harmony to be strong enough to counter Chinese military forces. Indeed, the Rouran were less victim of covert actions by the Chinese, which used to be the case during the Xiongnu and later Göktürk eras, and indeed capable of defending their borders. As we shall see later, the ambitions of the Khagans led to a different direction than they had promised to their people. Speaking of, the term kaganat refers to a state that is being ruled by said kagan. The entire state apparatus is aligned to him. He was the supreme ruler and, in theory, legitimized by Tengri, the god of the sky, to rule over the entire steppe belt. In theory. In practice, the Kagan stemmed from the ruling dynasty, which Chinese sources recorded as Yujiulu. Usually, his successor would be his brother, or if he had none, his eldest son. The Kagan declared war and made peace. He was thus the representative of the state to the outside world. However, A kagan often had to prove himself to be capable enough to lead the country.
Now, it's interesting that they're using the title kagan. That was a title that was not, you just didn't pick it up off the street. It was not a title that was taken, like you had to be able to prove something, to establish something. Either you took it by conquest or you were descended from one of the kaganal dynasties. And in the Central Eurasian world, these dynasties are rather long-lived.
The first kagan of the Rouran Empire was, naturally, also its de facto founder, Xiongnu. He had fled from eastern Mongolia to the west after his clan had lost against the northern Wei dynasty and took refuge with his uncle. As his power among his relatives grew, they became wary of his ambitions. Xiongnu preemptively gathered an army of warriors and killed his cousins, eventually even his uncle. As both his relatives and the Wei were after him, he migrated again through the Gobi Desert and gathered new supporters on the way. Then he defeated the Turkic Tegreg tribes, who are also known as the Gauche or Tiele. His power grew so much that other tribes submitted to him. Xiongnu then adopted the title of Kagan and declared the new Rouran Khaganat. Rouran is how the Chinese sources render their name, and it's a wordplay with Huan, which means annoying wriggling worms. This description was used in Chinese sources to clarify how scared they were of the Rouran, not at all. However, Xiongnu expanded his empire's influence very quickly, aiding several Chinese kingdoms like the later Qin against the Wei. After several raids on the border to the Wei, he captured one of the Chinese emperor's advisors. The emperor, Miguan, personally led an army to free his advisor in May 410. During a battle, Xiongnu died of his wounds and was succeeded by his brother Aikugai, as his sons had been too young to rule. But this conflict had not been won between the Mongol Xiongnu and the Chinese Miguan. On the surface, two worlds collided near the Yellow River, as had happened in the case of the Xiongnu centuries earlier. But Xiongnu's actual title was Qiudufa, and Emperor Miguan's personal name was Mumo. Both rulers were descended from Xianbei tribes. While Qiudufa's ancestors were the Donghu, Mumo stemmed from the Tuoba families that had split from the Xianbei. The Tuoba were also called Tabgach by the Gökturks much later. They were not Chinese at all, but Turkic and Mongolic families that slowly overtook political affairs in northern China. In the process, they did adopt parts of Chinese political culture, clothing, and so on. But even as the Tuoba consolidated rule under the Northern Wei banner, its nobles kept their non-Chinese personal names. This syncretic approach would lead to problems much later. As the great historian René Grousset once remarked, it was the Tuoba dynasty of the Wei, whom he deems to be of Turkic origin, that kept the Donghu Mongol Rouran warriors out of Chinese territory. For the rest of Rouran history, they would indeed fail in the perpetual war against the Wei. This defeat did not stop the Rouran, however, from expanding, as several Rouran rulers became involved in an intricate affair of diplomacy and war against the Northern Wei and other dynasties south of the Yellow River. One of the most powerful Kagans was Datan. The cousin of Hulu, Xiongnu's successor, he became Kagan after defeating his rival, Bulugen, and eliminating other contenders. He allied with Feng Ba, emperor of the small but prestigious Yan dynasty. Its founder had been of Goguryeo descent. Datan fostered good relations with the Yan, sending horses on a yearly basis. Then, immediately after Taiwu became emperor of the Northern Wei in 423, Datan invaded China with an army of up to 60,000 warriors. A hotspot of this conflict was the Ordos region, another natural boundary between the Chinese culture to the south and east, and the nomadic and Mongolic and Turkic cultures to the north and west, respectively. Despite early setbacks, including heavy losses due to frostbite, Datan's attacks established a pattern of Rouran raids, followed by Wei counterattacks led by Taiwu, but without decisive victories for the Wei. In 429, Taiwu launched one last major campaign. Despite achieving a significant victory, Taiwu failed to capture Datan due to hesitations and the belief that it might be a trap. Datan later died of illness in 429 and was succeeded by his son, Wuti. Datan is a very important figure in Turko-Mongol history, because as every other Kagan too, he was constantly struggling to keep his power within the Rouran state. During the conflict against the Wei Empire, Datan was able to gather a loyal group of nomadic warriors who defended his rule. After Datan's death, they might have become semi-autonomous within the Rouran Khaganat. Then, more than 100 years later, Bumin of the Ashina Turks had become new Kagan in the region, fighting all Rouran regardless of caste. During Bumin's funeral, so the Turkic Orkhon inscriptions tell us, mourners of many different states and tribes gathered in Ötüken to pay their respects. Among them the 30 Tatar, 30 Tatars. As historians have reconstructed Datan's actual name to be Tatar, it is very likely that the descendants of his loyalist group were the 30 Tatar of the Orkhon inscriptions. After the Rouran's fall, they fled to the Khingan Mountains in the east and later engaged in both diplomacy and war with the Turks. The Tatar name was used for many peoples in the Middle Ages and beyond, but it might have had originated from this Kagan of the Rouran Empire much earlier. Consequently, factions within a nomadic empire can lead to strife and civil war. This was the case with almost all nomadic states, and the Rouran are not exempt from the rule. The clear-cut administrative structure of the state did allow for better control and governance of its realm, containing elements of feudalism. Naturally, to keep their power, they not only had to wage war against their neighbors, but also put down revolts by displeased internal factions and tribes. As they expanded westwards, they fully subjugated the Tegreg Turks and, along the way, the Ashina tribe at the Altai in 460. The Rouran invaded the Tarim Basin, gaining control of the Eastern Silk Road, and even vassalized the Hephthalite Empire, thus gaining control of the Western Silk Road. The countless wars against the Wei, though, weakened the Rouran internally. A civil war broke out, and shortly thereafter, in 508, the Tegreg fought the Rouran and became independent. A certain Anagui claimed the throne and in 516 defeated the Tegreg, making them subjects of the Rouran once again. This Kagan henceforth ruled with an iron fist. In the following 3 decades, the empire was marked by stability, but also slowly went into demise. As the Rouran successfully vassalized the Hephthalite Empire, they came into contact with sedentary elements of the latter's societies. After becoming a tributary state of the Chinese themselves, even more sedentary influences appeared throughout the Kaganate. The Chinese sources claim that the Rouran would have built an actual city, Mumocheng. Anagui was credited with building this city that was, supposedly, encircled with 2 walls and constructed by the Chinese man Liang Shu. Meanwhile, Anagui also oversaw the Rouran's control of trade routes. This granted his empire access to many valuable items and skilled workers. He also received doctors, artisans, and weavers from China. But just as the Rouran had seemingly established themselves within the larger framework of history, a few events in the west of the empire proved to be utterly catastrophic, both for Anagui and his empire's sake. The aforementioned Ashina Turks had been subjugated by 460. As they continued to dwell at the Altai Mountains, they continuously expanded their influence. By 542, a young Turk called Bumin had become chieftain. He roamed throughout the empire and attacked China. Then, another revolt of the Tegreg Turks broke out. This time, the Ashina intervened and actually defeated the Tegreg. Bumin incorporated those Turkic warriors into his own tribal army. In both cases, he had acted completely autonomously from Anagui, his overlord and master. In an infamous chapter of both Turkic and Mongolic history, Bumin requested something from his overlord for seemingly saving his rule from the Tegreg, Anagui's daughter. The Kagan, meanwhile, had become rather old and fragile. Within 30 years, he had stabilized the Rouran Khaganat. But his authoritarian rule had alienated his subjects more than ever before. He sent an envoy to Bumin, calling the Turk a blacksmith and slave. Bumin then executed the envoy and cut all relations with Anagui. Then Bumin married a princess of the Western Wei Dynasty, a successor state of the Wei Empire, effectively establishing an Ashina-Tuoba alliance. Shortly thereafter, Bumin defeated the Rouran in a small skirmish near the Altai region and then crushed a larger army near Huaihuang. The second defeat was so devastating that the Rouran military collapsed. As Bumin was approaching their capital, Anagui committed suicide. The Kagan had not been killed in battle or even executed by his blacksmith slave, but vanished before the war was officially over. Perhaps the fear of personal retaliation from the Turks had been too big to handle. This caused the Rouran nobility to split too. One part fled to the south, to both Chinese empires, and the other part quickly moved to the northwest, towards Europe. The rule of the Rouran came to an end. The remnants involved the Turks into border skirmishes along the Yellow River for the next 3 years, but were defeated both by the Turks and the Northern Qi Dynasty, the second successor state of the Wei Empire. It is here where we must divert our attention to the west. Because the other Rouran nobles did not try to take back the homeland, instead fleeing from the Turks along the steppe belt. They would indeed become mighty once again, establishing the Avar Empire in the middle of Europe.